Recovery on Air, the official podcast of Crossroads Addiction Rehabilitation. Candid discussion about addiction and recovery with the people who have lived it, along with input from experts on the journey from struggle to triumph. Laugh, cry, and be inspired. And now, your host for Recovery on Air, Donna Alexander.
Welcome to Recovery on Air, the show in which we work to break the stigma of addiction by talking about it. I'm your host, Donna Alexander.
I'm your co-host, Ashley Walton.
And I am so happy to welcome into the studio today, Renee Siegel. So I looked you up a little bit from some of the emails that we exchanged, and you have a lot of initials. So let's start by going through those, because I know some of them completely pertain to what we're going to be talking about today. And I think you have a few extras that are thrown in there too.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I think some of us continue to learn because we don't feel like we have enough information. And I know I'm one of those people who feel like I've been a lifelong learner because I feel like if I get another certification or another degree, somehow or another, I'll be able to help more people.
Yeah.
At this point, part of my personal work is to get no more degrees because those letters after my name, although they've been helpful, at some point, you just have to leave your legacy. I'm at an age right now where it's really more important that I leave my legacy versus go back to school.
Right.
So I was educated as a marriage and family therapist 42 years ago in Detroit, Michigan. Moved to Arizona over 30 years ago. When I first finished my master's program in marriage and family therapy, I went to work in an addictions treatment center and was asked to put family therapy programs together for addictions treatment centers in downtown Detroit.
Wow.
Talk about a task.
Wow.
That was a big task. And I kept wondering, why am I doing all this recovery work? And I came to find out that I was the child of a physician who was writing prescriptions in all of our names.
Oh, wow.
And was an addict. And I thought he was a rageaholic. I knew he was a sex addict, but I had no idea that I was the daughter of an addict. When that became evident, my whole career took a very, very different course. Being in recovery communities felt very different because I was now one of the recovery community. Went on to marry a compulsive gambler and got a certification in treating compulsive gambling, and am a licensed addictions therapist in the state of Arizona and an internationally certified coach so that I can take some of my skills and bring them into the coaching world, which is different than the counseling world. Went on to become a holistic healthcare practitioner because so many addicts could not respond to antidepressants and they needed supplements instead, so I wanted to understand that. I am not a master in that. I know a little bit about that, though. And I don't remember what the others.
Oh, wait, I have
initials.
them. Would you like me to run through them really quick?
I think that's enough. I think that's enough. Yeah, I think
because
that's
really the addiction part, of course, and compulsive gambling too, those kind of things are what feeds into what Crossroads does, which is substance use disorder treatment, residential, intensive outpatient,
yes,
Crossroads aftercare program. We have CCOM, Crossroads Community Outreach.
Yes.
There's a lot that still needs to be done just in the addiction field. With fentanyl, I'm not sure we're ever going to catch up.
Yeah,
but
right.
You know what? We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep throwing it out there and trying to come up with new programs to, like you said, help more people.
Right.
So then explain to me a little bit. You said that coaching and counseling are different. What does that look like?
So counseling is really, gives, with the education and the background that people get as counselors, you're able to do an archaeological dig. You're able to really look at people's pasts. You're able to do a lot of helping them to gather insight. I think you play a different role in that archaeological dig of the past and understanding how the past contributes to the present. And I think coaching is more about building architecture. It's more about taking what's going on currently. And although both of them are very client-led, I think it takes a very different skill set to be a counselor. One of the great skills I have is the ability to navigate between both of those terrains.
Oh, wow.
And to go down into that archaeological dig with people who are suicidal or having really large trauma issues related to their addiction, and then create some level of stability and then build architecture. coaches build architecture and counselors can do archaeological digs. And I think like I said, I think it's a great gift to be able to do both.
Wow.
Especially in the addictions community, because I think both of them are so critical. And there's so much shame that happens that has to not just be dealt with in that archaeological dig, but really that architecture that builds, helps people build their life back, is coaching. And I think that's a big part of why peer recovery and coaching has become so incredibly important in the addictions community too.
That's what we do. We are a peer-driven
Right.
facilities. I mean, all of our facilities, probably, we were just talking about it this morning, it's like 80% of our team are in recovery, and most of them came through the program. So I think that's one of the blessings. I know you see that at the women's facility.
Absolutely, yes.
That if you're a peer and you're just asking them to do what you did when you came through.
Right.
I used to say, because I actually am one of the few that did not go through the Crossroads program. I did my first year of recovery in Montana and came into Crossroads when I was about 2 years sober, or 18 months, I guess it was. But to walk through the whole process, and even though I didn't go through the program, I still wasn't asking them to do something that I had not done myself in one way or another. And, one of the things that I used to tell them is you can't bullshit a bullshitter.
No.
What you're talking about, I've already done. And I mean, when they tell you something and you look at them and you say, I know, they're like, how do you know that? Would you care if I share that part of my story with you? Well, most of the time they're always going to say yes, unless they're just really mad and then they don't.
Right, right.
But most of the time they'll let you, and then they're like, oh. And I think that that's one of the biggest pieces of hope that Crossroads offers, is that these people get to see where you can land. I always used to tell them, you know what? I've walked a mile in your shoes. The great thing about this program is you can walk a mile in mine too. You just got to do the work.
Right.
Yes.
And it's organic compassion.
Yes.
It's an organic sense of compassion. I remember when I first started working in the field, and I had my typical patient in Detroit, downtown Detroit, was a person who was in their mid-50s, person of color. And they kept saying, I came up from the deep south, from a sharecropping family, came into the city of Detroit, got sent up there because they were going to make some money and send it back down to their families who were still living down south. And they said, how can you even relate to what we're talking about? And I had to be really honest. At that point, I didn't even know that I was the daughter of an addict. And I said, I don't know what you've been through. And so you need to help me understand, because if we're going to pair together and partner in this process of recovery, I need for you to help me understand it. And I won't understand what your situation is based on my situation. So I get it. I mean, you start out in a totally different place. And for those of us who found out we were in the in the right place a little later on, then our stories kind of unfold and change. But I had no clue at the time that I was first put there in a practicum, after my graduate degree, that I had anything in common with these men, and yet they were so open when I was open to saying,
Right.
I don't know. You have to help me. I don't get this. I don't get what it's like to have been moved far away from my family. I don't get to understand what it is like to be a male, a person of color in your mid-50s. I was in my 20s at the time. There were so many differences. So I think compassion, the piece that, that's unfolded as a result of you sharing your story, can be accessed too. And I think it's a really huge part of recovery.
Well, I commend you for doing what you did and to throw it out there and be honest, because I know one of the things for myself, and I think for a lot of other people in recovery, is when we have somebody, and it happens often, I'm sure you've seen it, where somebody that has learned this stuff from a book, that doesn't have the real, experience or whatever, is not willing to say, you know what, I don't know. Help me understand. Most of the time they're saying, no, this is how it's done, and da-da-da-da-da. And that doesn't generally work with people
No, they
like
can
us.
see right through you.
Right.
And yeah, absolutely. And so I commend you for being able to throw that out there, because I don't know really of very many people that are willing to listen to somebody that is just trying to tout the book knowledge that they have.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we'll listen at some point. Like, I had a therapist and myself, so we did both together, but she also understood about addiction somewhat, and she was a compassionate person. But the girls would used to say, I don't want to hear from somebody who learned this from a book. I want to talk to the girl who is walking down Van Buren when it's 120 degrees barefoot looking for her next trick so she can get her next fix. She's like, I want to know what that person did to get where she is now.
Right.
Not how somebody read it out of a book.
I get it. I absolutely get it. I used to sneak into AA meetings back then. And at that point in time, many, many years ago, NA, people who had drug addicts were not welcome in AA.
Right.
The term chemical dependency had not even been coined.
Right.
Those drug addicts stayed over there and those alcoholics stayed over there. And so it was a very, very different, but I snuck into meetings because I thought, you know, these meetings, these guys who are going to meetings are getting just as much from these meetings as they are from my therapy. What's this all about?
Yep.
And so the 12 steps became like such an incredible part of even what I do in my therapy. I'll ask clients all the time, you know, where are you at in your step work, and how are you and your sponsor working together on that? And are you stuck anywhere? And have you found that when you do step 3, 4, and 5, that it's kind of a turning point? And you know, do you really have the supports between 4 and 5 to navigate? Because so many people relapse around that time.
Yes.
So, I mean, just having that information and being willing to do my own step work in Al-Anon and Gam-Anon in my own personal recovery, and I don't think that I would have even ventured into Al-Anon and Gam-Anon had I not snuck into those AA meetings way back when.
Exactly.
And saw the value of the steps.
So when did you figure out, or when was it brought to your attention that, oh my gosh, my dad is a full-blown addict?
Yeah. It's really kind of sad, but
it is what it is in this world.
It's my story, right? I think I had been working in recovery for about 6 years, and I was sent to my uncle's store to pick up a prescription for my dad. And I went to his store, and there were 6 prescriptions, and all of my brothers and sisters and my mom and my dad and my name. So six prescriptions for Valium were sitting there for me to pick up for 1 month for my father.
Wow.
And I thought, this is not right. This is really not right. And I knew just enough about addictions at that point to start asking questions. And I also got met with a lot of, you don't want to know about this, or this is really none of your business, and so I just started doing a lot of digging. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for about the addictions community and field today is that they've really looked at the role of benzos and on what a problem they are.
Wow.
Because my father died addicted to benzodiazepines.
Yep.
They could never titrate him off enough for him to deal with the underlying anxiety that he had, a rebound anxiety that he had developed as a result of being a benzo addict. And he drank. I don't know that he was an alcoholic, but he certainly was chemically dependent. And he played with other drugs too. So I approached him, you know, after all of this happened. My dad, who was a doctor, and me, who was this little peon. And I said, you know, there are psychiatrists, there are people who can help you, there are your peers, there are all sorts of ways. Your depression and your anxiety, you don't have to be dealing with this. They're really probably made worse by your addiction. I don't think they're getting help. You're getting helped in any way. And you rage. And I used to think you had an anger problem. And what I'm realizing is you have a chemical dependency problem. And so we had some candid conversations when he was titrating off or actually working with helping professionals. And then we had other conversations where it was just, I love my dad because he's my dad, but this is really rough. I did a lot of ACA work.
Yes.
I mean, I've been a lot of the self-help, in and out of a lot of the self-help communities. And then I found the Enneagram, which was kind of my tie-in for all of it, because I realized that through the lens of my personality type, there were some things that I could do that I had some control over. It was like almost like the Serenity Prayer came alive when I discovered the Enneagram. It's like, okay, this is the basket of what you can do something about. This is the basket that you can do nothing about. And maybe there's a place in here where you can, you know, engage in grounded presence and compassionate inquiry and just being a loving human being, and let all of this come together through the lens of your type. And that's probably been the greatest gift of all, is my discovery of the Enneagram.
So you've used 12-step programs, which have been an integral part of your recovery or what you do in coaching and counseling. And now you've gotten into the Enneagrams. Is that, am I saying that right? And so I want to ask a question before we deep dive, if you will, into that in your book concerning Enneagrams and trauma. What is the difference between what that is and Myers-Briggs and the Young test?
Absolutely. So there are lots of personality tests out there. You just identified Myers-Briggs. There's True Colors. There's the DISC. There's Gallup Strength Finders. There's a lot of them. But the Enneagram differs in several ways. One of them is that the Enneagram, the foundational principles of the Enneagram are 3,000 years old.
Wow.
None of those others have a history like this at all. So they were basically foundational principles that were where all of the world's major spiritual traditions overlapped. And they were passed down in a verbal way because back then, really heavy-duty spiritual truths were only given through verbal handing down to the next generation or to people who are priests or rabbis or imams. And they all came through Sufism, which is a spiritual tradition of Islam, and the Kabbalah, which is a spiritual tradition of Judaism, and contemplative Christianity, which is a spiritual tradition of the Desert Fathers of Christianity. None of which we see played out in our major religions today, unfortunately. So there's this huge spiritual component. It's ancient. And when we look at the personality aspect of it, one of the things that none of those other systems do is evaluate and investigate, or I should say investigate and then evaluate the motivation for why people want to do what they do. So I'll give you an example. If I was to have a group full of people and I asked them a question, how many of you want to be good people? The majority of people in the room would raise their hands. And if I then said to all the people in the room, could you tell me why you want to be a good person? What motivates you to be a good person? Why is it important to be a good person? The languaging and the rationale and the information would be so different. So different. So we look at the core motivating factors underneath each kind of decision and each thought and each belief and each behavior, and we see them come to light in such different ways. None of those other personality systems evaluate motivation. None of them.
So answer the question. Do you want to be a good person?
Of course.
And then, so why? And I'm thinking that same
speechless.
thing. Yeah. As what you just said is that I'm thinking, yes, I want to be a good person. And why do I want to be a good person? I want to say because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
I mean, is that something that we're born with, or is it just that we don't know how to answer the question?
Well, I think if you think about it for a minute, I think you'll come up with what it means to you to be a good person. And my answer to that was, why wouldn't everyone want to be a good person? What would be wrong with someone that they wouldn't want to be a good person? And so we start to evaluate some of the differences between how we would look at that. Or I've heard people answer that question with, well, that's what my religion raised me to do, or I'll get in trouble, or I'll go to hell. Or, there's so many answers to that question of why you want to be a good person. And you start to really sit with that person and investigate why that's so important to them. And you start to hear the language of the lens of type. So there are 9 Enneagram types. The word Enneagram means 9. It's a diagram of 9. The Enneagram, I think, is inside of the O in the book Reclaiming You,
which is
we'll
your
talk
book.
about.
We'll
right,
talk about.
Right. So it's 9 types, 9 lenses of the ways people think differently, have different belief systems, feel differently, have different emotional responses to things, and react differently, have a different behavioral response, or have a different felt internal body sense. And where that really is important, also as differing from many of these other personality systems, is you don't see personality systems that have you addressing behaviors other than behaviors. You don't hear them talking about an embodied experience as being different. What do I feel in my body? What's going on inside my body viscerally, somatically?
Oh, like
That's
I'm different. My heart's palpitating. My hands are sweating.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or, I get a pain in my hip every time I start to think about, using. Or, I mean, when we really start to investigate what's going on in the body, a series of things happen that we have access to that we can get into and down the road here. But you don't hear those in other personality systems. They're not talking about an embodied sense of what's going on.
They really just give you, this is what type you are. This is kind of what that means. But I don't see that they give any kind of solution.
No, they just tell you what you are, I feel like.
Well,
Yeah.
I think they give you some solutions, like you'd be really good at doing this if you have this kind of
true that.
personality. This is your strength, and these are your challenges. And the Enneagram certainly does that as well. But I think that you're right. That's where they stop. It's like, this is your strength. These are your challenges. And sometimes they even talk about how to create teams or engage in relationships that help you to move past those things. But when you understand why you're doing it, what it is, what little part of your self that was developed way, 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 way before you even learned how to talk, that's kind of responding to that, that's a game changer.
Okay, so let's start there. Before,
Okay.
let's hear about what your thoughts are about this. And Ashley and I are going to sit here and listen to you and try to take it in.
Okay.
So let's go, Renee.
Okay, so the Enneagram has 9 different personality types. And along with those 9 personality types, which we can go through in a minute, there's also a recognition of 3 portals or 3 ways that we take in information. We take in information logically, strategically, mentally mapping through our minds. We take in information through our heart in this heartfelt way. Ugh, you say, oh. Well, that gives us a clue. And then we take in information intuitively in our belly, in these ways where we want to engage with the world through this sense of knowing without a logical or an emotional component, but we just know it's the right thing to do because our belly has told us it's the right thing to do. And so each one of those has value. Even the of the heart has value, right? Yeah. So, strategically we mentally map and come up with solutions, and our executive functioning comes online and is kind of essential, in coming up and using our head center. In our heart center, we have to go to a very tender, vulnerable space, which is probably where your came from. Yeah. Yeah. You have to sit with a space of being.
I don't like it.
Most people don't like being vulnerable. That's another one of those questions that I ask to a group of
Yikes.
people. How many people like being vulnerable? Nobody raises their hand. And then I ask, why would you not want to be vulnerable?
Fear.
And you hear so many differences. Fear. I don't want to appear weak. This is just not even something.
Rejection.
Right, exactly. So different. Those responses are so different. So then we start to hear the lens of type. We start to hear people talking about things through the lens of their own Enneagram type. So we have these types. We have these centers and how we take in information. Each one of the types sits in a different center. So 8s, 9s, and 1s are body types. They live with an intuitive kind of moving forward in an intuitive way of being in the world. 2s, 3s, and 4s. And one of the reasons I can't relate to the is because I'm a 2. I sit in the heart center. So I lead with that, and the 5, 6s, and 7s are the mentalizing and strategizing types. And they're head centered. And oftentimes in our culture, we get really waylaid because the 5, 6s, and 7s are the ones that get real recognition in the world. We've lost what we call value in our heart, leading from our hearts and leading from our bellies. And when you think about the indigenous peoples of the world, they all led from their belly centers, most of them. They knew things about how to navigate the stars and how to navigate, the oceans without having the science that we have today. Yeah, they learned how to read the experiences and what was going on in their bodies, and they were right. The other thing that's really cool about the body center is the body center occurs in real time. So we can go from this past. I'm thinking about all the things that have happened in my past, and then I speculate on all the things that are going to happen in the future. And it's very hard to be very focused on what's going on right now. But if I go into my body, whether it's through my breath or through a pain I have in my tummy or through my heartache, I am experiencing the world in real time right now. My body doesn't have a heartache yesterday. My toe doesn't hurt tomorrow. My head isn't pounding tomorrow or yesterday. I'm reflecting on something that's going on right here and right now. And there is such a gift in being in the present. They call the present a present because it is a gift, right, of being in the present. So you have an aspect of when you enter through the body center, you can kind of experience the opening to mindfulness, this whole idea of what is going on right here and right now. And that is so helpful. In recovery, one of the really cool things about the Enneagram is it's when you start to realize that these personality issues are they've created your resilience as well as the vulnerability to your recovery. It's a natural shame reducer. And so many of us in the recovery community are riddled with shame. And so organically, just teaching people about the Enneagram, and they go, oh, I'm a 5. I like to learn. I'm a researcher. I've gathered information. This is like an amazing skill that I have. Oh, and I like to isolate, and I'm not around people. And this is also an amazing thing that I do. That could potentially get me in trouble. So you see that through the lens of type, there are all of these aspects. Some of them are very becoming and easy to embrace and say, oh, that's who I am. And then there's others that are like, ooh, that's who I am too. That's my shadow side. That's the part of me that's less becoming. It's the part of me that I really don't particularly love to talk about. But it's the whole package. So there are these just beautiful gifts that come with the lens of type when you start to talk about type that make it such a cool recovery tool. That being said, you can't do a seriously deep dive with someone in early recovery with the Enneagram.
Right.
You don't want to uncover and unfold things because number one, you could traumatize someone, you could re-traumatize someone. And number two, so many people don't even respect until they've got several years of recovery under their belt that it took a couple of years for their cognitive functioning to come back online. They didn't realize that they were just like a stew pot of emotions or couldn't sort out their beliefs and thoughts. That's why AA and 12 steps and things like that in peer recovery, there's no support for that. And I shouldn't say that. There's no substitute for that, rather, is what I was trying to say. Those are essential ingredients. And so you have to really be mindful of how the Enneagram comes in. It's a great reminder for someone as a shame reducer, and that they can see they grow. There's kind of this organic self-awareness that unfolds when they start looking at people of their same type. And that's like kind of, again, it takes the shame and kind of moves it down several notches. But you can't do a deep dive because that's just irresponsible.
Dangerous. Yes. I've often thought that about people. We're just not ready. I was not ready to handle my traumas. Really like my first 5 years. Right. Some of those things, you know. So how does it work, though? So do you have like a list of questions that you...
There are lots of assessment tools that someone can take to find out their Enneagram type. And everybody wants to know what their type is. That's kind of the first search is what's my type. And one of the things that I feel is very important is to realize that the journey to finding your type, identifying your type, and you only have one type, it doesn't change in your lifetime. The journey to finding your type is really rich because it requires your own growing self-awareness. And self-awareness is only goes on as you begin to notice and investigate and sit with yourself, and then do more noticing and investigating and sitting with yourself, and on and on and on. So as that process unfolds and you get to know yourself better, again, it's another huge game changer in terms of the recovery. We want every person on the planet to know themselves better, because if we really got to know ourselves better, we would all realize that we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Absolutely.
And wanting deeply to be loved, to be heard, to be seen, and to feel safe. And boy, would that not be a great lesson in our world today to heal us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
okay, so let's recap here. So the 3 types, and this is what I'm taking from this. Please correct me, because I'm hearing heart, head, stomach.
Heart, head, and body. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So stomach, because that's the
belly. We call them the belly type. Yeah. So we have
gut feeling.
Yeah. 8s, 9s, and 1s are part of that gut and body belly type. 2s, 3s, and 4s are the heart types, emotionally led. And the 5s, 6s, and 7s are the head types. They strategize and are more into logic. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that we always lead with that center. So my heart center as a 2, a type 2 is the type that is more aware of other people's emotions than their own.
Oh.
So I had a lot of work to do on just coming home to my own emotions. And that wasn't easy, especially if you are paid to be a therapist and coach, because you can be paid to stay into other people's stuff for a
A
long
long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
A long time. So how long does it take to do like one of these tests to figure out what your type is?
There's some of them are free online. Takes just a couple of minutes. Some of them are paragraphs. You can have typing interviews with a seasoned professional like myself. You can pay for tests that cost anywhere from $2-3 all the way to $250.
Wow.
That'll give you a 50-page report. Enneagram has just blossomed in terms of its popularity, especially since the pandemic, because people were left with themselves.
Yes.
They were looking at themselves. They were trying to navigate, oh my God, how am I going to live being away from everybody else? And I'm stuck with myself. And some of us were stuck with ourselves and not with other people and didn't have as many distractions as we generally did. And fear was rising and all sorts of things. So people were looking for tools like this, and the Enneagram skyrocketed in popularity during the pandemic.
Absolutely. So tell us, if you can, obviously with anonymity involved here, like some of the stories where you've seen somebody that's come in and you've been able to help them with this, and maybe even one that's progressed and really gathered it, and then one maybe that didn't accept so much and didn't do so well.
So let's talk about the assets and the resilience and
Yes.
the kind of challenges of each of the types in
Let's do
recovery.
that. Let's do that.
Yeah. So we'll start chronologically, even though I generally like to start with type 8 because at the top of the Enneagram, it's the first body type. We're going to start chronologically for this discussion. So type 1 is the chronological number we'll start with. And type 1s are considered perfectionistic. And one of the really interesting things about type 1s, because I've dealt with compulsive gamblers as well as substance abusers for so long, is that type 1s don't like to have two addictions going on at the same time.
Oh, wow.
We hear oftentimes about trading addictions, right? That's a pretty common thing. Type 1s generally don't trade addictions because they're so into the moral aspect and the ethical aspect of how badly they feel for being an active addict. They will finish one addiction before they start another. They won't just trade. Or they won't be as often poly addicted as other addictions. So I think that's pretty.
I'm probably not a 1 then.
Definitely not me.
Probably.
I was doing them all at the same time, so I'm probably not a 1. So
Nope.
that answers that question.
Yes. So the challenge of 1s is that they want to do it perfectly. They want to do it right. And there's no perfection in recovery.
Right.
There's no perfection in addiction. There's no perfection in recovery. And their challenge then is to see the serenity in everything that exists in the world and the perfection of imperfection.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's our type 1s. Type 2s are our givers and our helpers. They tend to be as codependent as they are chemically dependent or compulsive gamblers. But oftentimes they'll use over-the-counter meds abusively, sleep meds abusively, because they have no sense of when they've overextended themselves in terms of taking care of other people. So I am a poster child for type 2s, a classic have done and continue to do a lot of work on appropriate boundaries and being codependent. But they can be, slot machine users just sitting there mindlessly playing the slots. They can take benzos to deal with their anxiety. And we all now know that benzos are highly addictive.
So bad. And one of the only 2, as far as I understand, that can kill you with detox, benzos and alcohol.
Yes, And the interesting thing is when, I've been in the field long enough that benzos were the actual way of navigating potential seizures and DTs in early recovery. So they became very popular with alcohol detox because they have a 21-day half-life and they kept people from moving into these fatal kinds of experiences with addiction. So they served that purpose, but people had no clue how seriously dangerous they were and the rebound effect that happens with benzos. Our type 3s are our performers. And they oftentimes are athletes. I see a lot of athletes that are type 3s, workaholics. Our country, the U.S., is very much just do it, kind of like the Nike slogan, just do it. They're very into performing, being effective, being productive. And so any of the things that would allow someone to be effective and perform, like cocaine is a very
Methamphetamine.
There you go. Right. Anything that's going to enhance the ability for performance is a highly likely substance. And I'm just giving you a general. There's so much more we could talk about this. I mean, I do week-long trainings on this, so I just want anybody that's hearing it that knows their Enneagram type and says, I'm a 3 and I didn't do that. This is just a very generalized conversation. Type 4s are romantics. They're the goth movement. They're the, oh my God, let me do some heroin and let me not out and let me just find the most hopelessly romantic experience I can have in my life, because actually basking in the sweetness of melancholy is my gig. And so they have the capacity, one of the high sides of this type is they have the capacity to sit with that that you described of emotion. They love the intensity of emotion.
Okay,
Johnny,
I'm not that one either. Then
yeah,
no,
right,
not me.
Right. So they will. We talked about what they use in their high side and low side. Type 5s are investigators or are observers. They're brainiacs. Bill Gates is a type 5. They have a tendency to use things that will alter their mood, like ayahuasca and LSD, any mind-altering substance. Now, before I go on to talk about the assets and challenges of 5, one of the things I was remiss in saying is that alcohol is the only equal opportunity drug for all Enneagram types.
You better believe it.
And part of that is because there's such an illusion around alcohol. People start drinking and they don't even realize it's a central nervous system depressant.
Right.
You go into a bar at happy hour and the voice level is like this, and then 2 hours later the voice level is like this, and you're asked to touch your nose and walk a straight line, and so you have this illusion that you're doing all of these things and that it's being excitatory when in fact it's a central nervous system depressant. So when we look at alcohol, there's no type that's more likely to be an alcoholic than any other type, which I find fascinating. So our type 5s will use hallucinogens, back to our 5s, and their task is to move from their head and the understanding of gathering all this information to move into their heart and their body and have a fully embodied, heartfelt experience in recovery, because they're smart and they just gather information and they sometimes will research. The neat thing about them is that they're one type that has less resistance to going to the fellowship of any of the anonymouses, which is kind of neat. Our type 6s are loyal skeptics, and they second guess themselves, have a lot of self-doubt. They play the devil's advocate. They'll have a tendency to either plunge through fear when they're frightened of things or move away from fear in a very phobic kind of stance. And because they take both of those stances, both moving forward and backward, you can imagine that they use different kinds of drugs to help them with those kinds of things. So if they want to plunge through fear, they might do an 8-ball or cocaine or methamphetamine. And if they're phobic, they might, drink and do heroin. It's like they're a mixed up bag depending on whether or not they lead with a phobic or a counterphobic stance. And our type 7s are epicures. They are the most likely to be addicts because they love options. They love experiencing life to the max. They like pushing the limits. They have a tendency to be an enthusiast or an epicure in all areas of their life. They just like it all. So you guys are looking at each other. Do I have some potential 7s sitting across from me? Yeah. And so the challenge of their recovery is to take the deep dive because they avoid pain at any cost. They really don't like pain. They don't like doing the deep dive, going into the really mucky muck of what we have to do to move through conflict and sadness and hurt and get to the other side of it is not an easy task. And so it takes a lot for them to not feel like they're going to be pulled out from under themselves to do that kind of work. And that's the real work of recovery, is that when people do that work, that's where the diamonds and the gold live.
Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And our type 8s are bullies and intimidators, and they lead with a lot of verve and lust for life. They're our challengers and our bosses and our Hell's Angels and our they see vulnerability as a sign of weakness, and they won't go there, and they are really very tender and sweet inside, but they lead with this sense of kind of a hard crusty exterior. So the challenge in recovery for them is very interesting. Number one, it's hard to get a therapist or a sponsor to work with them, because unless that person feels that they can really respect that individual and that person is strong enough to hold the energy around this huge person that's really a sweet little tender individual inside, they test people. They test people. But when they do recovery, oh, it is the sweetest. It is the most innocent and sweet and tender thing, because they realize that vulnerability is a strength and not a weakness. That was the seriously most Reader's Digest condensed version I've ever done of the Enneagram.
So now can you like say, so you have the three that go with this type of person, can they cross over?
Well, if you look at the map of the Enneagram, or true map of the Enneagram, you'll see that the map has these lines between the types, and it has arrows between the types, and there are wings of types, and there are centers of intelligence. So there's lots of movement, and that's pretty complicated. We could talk about that perhaps in another show, because that's a really complicated explanation. But there's a lot of influencing that happens between the lines that the types move to, and the centers that they sit in, and the wings that sit on either side of those types.
Wow. So there's a lot more to that to this whole thing than just
Right.
these three types.
Well, that's the challenge of bringing the Enneagram anywhere, is that it's a complicated system. It's a really interesting system. It's a very thorough system. It's a very holistic system, but it's not something like, it's very typical for somebody to watch a TikTok video for 30 seconds to 2 minutes. You're not going to get the Enneagram understanding in one of those videos at all. That's not happening. Takes time.
So I read that this goes along with trauma in your book and stuff. So, I mean, I can pick up in here, but maybe for our listeners, how does this work together with the trauma and the work that you do?
Sure. So, trauma has become a really popular thing since about the year 2000. We've really understood, and it's been a great opening for the Enneagram community. I mean, for the addiction community, because we understand that we can have a lot more compassion to understand addictions through the lens of trauma. There are not very many people who I've ever dealt with in full-blown addiction that do not have trauma sitting
Absolutely.
under their addiction. I think that really, if we're going to do some ongoing research, I think what we're going to find is those people who have less trauma have actually moved through, the periods in their life where they've been abusive, substance abusive, that don't become addicts. I think where we see the addicts show up are those people who have sat with trauma and they realize, oh my goodness, I have found my silver bullet to take a vacation from all the trauma in my life. So when we look at addictions, I think, and trauma, it's a no-brainer to really examine those. In the book Reclaiming You, that's just recently been released and available for pre-order on Amazon right now,
okay,
and on Barnes & Noble, I believe, right now. We've examined all sorts of trauma. We've examined complicated addictions, complicated grief, natural disasters, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, the pandemic.
Good.
And all sorts of things that we know have created trauma in people's life. And, one of the gifts of the pandemic is it really made trauma a normalized word. There is not one person who has navigated this experience with all the global issues we face, but certainly the pandemic and the social distancing and all of the issues of not being able to move our bodies in the ways that we have, move around freely and connect with the people that we love, or question our own safety. All of those things became very obvious to people who maybe hadn't had periods of trauma. So my co-author and I decided to write this book through the lens of various traumas, and looking at how the Enneagram, and through the lens of your type, understanding your Enneagram type, you have either a greater likelihood to move into that type of trauma and a greater gift to have the resilience to move out of that type of trauma. Very similar to what we were just talking about in the addictions community. When you look at addictions through the lens of your type, it's like, wow, this is how I spiraled down into addictions, because I was avoiding all of these particular things. And at the same time is, oh my God, these are the assets of my type and the resilience features and qualities of my type that I can use to embrace recovery in a really meaningful, full-bodied way. So it's just a comprehensive look at how trauma and the Enneagram can be combined to really take a look at the resilience in recovery from not only addictions, but the other types of trauma as well. And that's what the book is all about.
So also what I think I'm hearing you say, it probably would not be a good idea for somebody to grab this book and try to do this all on their own.
They could. We've written this for the lay public.
Okay, so we could do that then.
Yep, you could. So
Nice.
We're pre-ordering that bad boy.
So I'll tell you a couple of things that are happening. One of them is that the book sets up in a very lay kind of way so that we're not doing deep dives. We set up from the beginning and throughout the book the notion that revisiting trauma is very different than being re-traumatized.
Talk to us about that real quick then.
Sure. Revisiting trauma is speaking about it. It's discussing it. You might have some sense of it in your body. You might not even feel particularly good, but we're able to go on with this conversation and it's not affecting you. Being re-traumatized is me having a conversation with you and you going to the bathroom after this and your head spinning, or feeling like you're going to throw up, or you can't finish work anymore because the physicalness of your body is now debilitated and you really need somebody to help you get through that, or something to help you through that. So the book is laid out that we talk about the physiology of trauma, the basics of the Enneagram in part 1. In part 2, we talk about, I think there's 10 different stories or 12 different stories of people who've been of various types who've been through trauma and what they've done through their type to resolve that trauma. And part 3 is all of these very cool practices to improve vagal tone, polyvagal, based on polyvagal theory, which is something that really helps reset your nervous system, which is part of what has to happen to deal with trauma. So the book is very practical. We have book clubs that we're creating, and people who actually have existing book clubs, where we're offering people to come into existing book clubs or create their own book clubs, and we're offering complimentary copies of the book so that people can review it for us and post what they believe about to be valuable about the book on Amazon. We really want this to be, we originally started writing a clinical book, and then we thought, if we want to cast a wide net and really want to help more people in the world, this clinical book is going to go into the hands of some therapists, some counselors, coaches. But we really wanted to do something much, much, much bigger than that. And because the pandemic was going on while we wrote the whole book, it was like, my whole central nervous system was seriously upset.
Yes.
I developed this. One of the things in the book is the 3M triad, which is about mindfulness, movement, and meaningful connections, which are the formula for checking in around wellness, and it's one of the templates that we use for trauma resolution. So yeah, I think the lay audience is fine to pick up the book, knowing that if they get re-traumatized, and we spell it out in the very beginning of the book, that they need to put the book down. But it's unlike other clinical books, like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is like a gold standard trauma book, and it re-traumatizes the heck out of people.
Oh, wow.
Because it's really meant for trauma professionals.
Clinicians, yeah.
But you know, I've had many clients who think it's an amazing book, and clinicians who think it's an amazing book, but they have had the experience of being re-traumatized as they really go into deep stories about all the specifics about being a Vietnam vet or something like that.
Right.
We do not do that. We do not go into the deep depths of traumatic experience. We talk topically about in the stories the trauma people experienced and what they did to move out of it.
So we're in the studio and we're talking with Renee Siegel about her new book. And what's it called?
Reclaiming You.
Reclaiming You, about the Enneagrams and trauma. And we've been talking a lot about substance use disorder too. So if anybody out there needs help, get on the Crossroads website. It's thecrossroadsinc.org, or call our admissions office at 602-263-5242. And again, Renee, you can find the book on Amazon, and it's a pre-order right now. Any idea when it's going to be delivered?
October 25th is the order date, and for those of you who want an earlier copy, I have ordered a ton of paperbacks, and I'll be happy to send out information to anybody. You can reach me at renee@yourpurepotential.com. It's the letter U, letter U and the letter R, then purepotential.com.
Nice. It has been a real pleasure listening to you today, and it's given me a little bit of insight into this. I definitely think I need to read the book. Now I want to know what type I am.
Absolutely. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here with us, and
Yeah.
thank you for all that you've done for the community of addiction.
Yeah, thank you
And
so
our
much for having me.
healing.
Yeah.
We appreciate you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Recovery on Air, the official podcast of Crossroads Addiction Rehabilitation, with your host, Donna Alexander. Join us next time as we continue our candid discussions about addiction and recovery. Listen 24/7 anytime to this or any of our shows online at starworldwidenetworks.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.